a little bit. We may have not been getting full coverage on this. I had a couple of comments that had come in. Um, I am Frosty Walker, the Chief Information Security Officer for the Texas Education Agency. And today we're going to do a cybersecurity tips and tools regarding mobile security. This is the second webinar in our Spring 2018 series regarding cybersecurity. And hopefully you'll find this information we're sharing with you today informative. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Should you have a question during the presentation, feel free to submit them, and we'll queue them up for the question and answer session. So I would like for somebody to indicate to me if they can hear and see the slides properly. So if somebody would drop us a note, I appreciate that very much. I know we've had some problems with the audio in the past, so we want to make sure that everybody can hear and see them. Thank you. So the Data Security Advisory Committee provides guidance to the Texas education communities, maximizing collaboration and communication regarding information security issues and resources which can be utilized within the educational community. The DSAC is comprised of representatives from school districts, ESCs, TEA, and the private sector. The DSAC is diverse in both size and geographically, with members who are willing to share needs, ideas, and time to hopefully provide solutions for everyday cybersecurity issues within the education community. So I'd like to take this time to thank all of those folks that participate on that data security advisory for dedicating their time to help with preventing and protecting cybersecurity in our educational communities. Thank you. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on our cybersecurity tips and tools, as well as a copy of the slides. That will be located at the Texas Gateway at https://www.texgateway.org under cybersecurity tips and tools. If you browse to that URL, you will see featured resources, and you will see the cybersecurity data, cybersecurity tips and tools as a featured resource. And that's where you will find all of the resources that we have shared. And we have shared over the last 2 years a number of resources regarding free training, incident response tools, a variety of tools that can be used. So if you haven't been to the Texas Gateway under cybersecurity tips and tools, please take the opportunity to go out there and see what all we've shared with you. Thank you. Today we're going to talk about mobile devices, but before we can talk about mobile devices, we also have to talk a little bit about wireless infrastructure. So we're going to cover both the infrastructure and mobile devices. But before we can talk about those things, we actually need to talk a little bit about basic information security concepts, such as confidentiality, integrity, availability, information leakage, denial of service, illegitimate use, and accountability. Every one of those apply in almost everything that we go to implement, whether that's a network with an application on it, or whether that's a network as an infrastructure, or in this case, as we're talking about a wireless infrastructure. All of those are key concepts that we need to take into consideration when we're designing and developing that infrastructure. And oftentimes I get asked questions like, well, I really don't care who has access to some of my network because it's just available to the internet. So why am I concerned about that? Well, you want to avoid illegitimate use. From time to time, you may have wireless services that extend the boundary of your building. You have users that could log on to that. access the dark net, sell or purchase, say for credit card information, and then in an investigation, the FBI finds an IP address from your wireless infrastructure that leads them to you, and then they're asking you to please help them identify somebody by the name of J. Doe that was logged on your network. So that's where accountability really comes into play in those basic concepts for a wireless network. We're also going to talk a little bit about basic communication issues, protecting content privacy, location privacy, and accessibility and linkability between a sender and recipients. We're also going to talk about basic objects to protect. We have information, whether that's a voice conversation against eavesdropping or whether that's data that's being transferred across that wireless infrastructure. But not just that type of data, there's also metadata that may be hidden within the data that's within documents that's being transmitted across that infrastructure. So those are a couple of things that we need to talk about and how we protect that information as well as the metadata. And within any application or any type of infrastructure that we're building, we're dealing with some basic elements: hardware, operating systems, and applications. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the wireless infrastructure and how you may want to set that up, or take a look at how yours that is currently set up. I typically recommend that you look at setting up 2 or 3 unique wireless networks. And I'll explain why I do that. First of all, you have guests that come to your premises that you want to allow to have wireless access. However, those folks, you want them to have to log in or authenticate of some type on a frequent basis, particularly like every day that they come in, because they're not there very often. But if you have employees that are bringing their own devices, for example, they're going to get very frustrated with you if they have to log in or authenticate on your network every day. But you still don't want those 2 groups probably shouldn't have access to anything that's behind your intranet. You want those 2 groups to have separate and have access only to the internet. If your employees need to use a BYOD device, and we'll talk a lot about those later, to access the internet, you probably want them to access that through a VPN connection or some secure connection, Citrix, for example, that would allow them to access that securely with that device. The only devices that I like to see that allow to access directly behind your internet are your institutional owned mobile devices, whether that's a laptop, could be a tablet, could be a phone that you have control of. But you want to have control of those devices if you're letting them access directly into your internet, which is behind your firewalls and potentially has the ability to browse or look around on your internal network and potentially have access to some of the applications that you're running. The mobile devices that we're going to talk specifically about today include laptops, tablets, smartphones, and any type of USB storage device. So what's stored on your mobile device that you don't want others to see? Well, you may have files on your memory card, whether that's a smartphone, a tablet, or access to a laptop. all of that may be applicable. You may have contacts that you consider sensitive as an organization or as an individual. Your contacts, who you have in your contacts, you may want to consider those as sensitive types of information. Email messages certainly may contain sensitive information. Pictures. Call or system logs. If you haven't taken a look at some of the system logs on a smartphone, you may be amazed at what your device is actually connecting to, what's stored in those system logs, where it's been. There's a lot of information that's stored in those system logs, and you want to protect that type of information. GPS location. Control over your microphone or your camera. You do not want someone to be able to potentially turn on your microphone or your camera without your knowledge. So you want to protect those and be able to be in control of those if at all possible. And of course, you have a phone identity number that is also that you'll want to protect. So let's talk just briefly about some of the vulnerabilities that we may encounter in mobile devices. You have physical access. You have social engineering. You may have devices that have been rooted or jailbroken. You have wireless connectivity, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, infrared, and other types of short-range connectivity that may be involved. You have email that can be vulnerable, SMS, and its transmission, depending on whether it's encrypted or not. You have third-party applications. You have USB cards and memory cards, operating systems. You even have databases running on most of your smartphones, as well as your tablets and your laptops. Cameras, microphones, cached credentials, a very big a problem as far as vulnerabilities and protecting those, as well as things that you download. Those are things that potentially can cause issues with mobile type devices. So how would we mitigate some of those vulnerabilities? And we talk about mobile device management. And we'll talk a little bit about managing your personal devices, as well as managing your BYOD devices and your institutionally owned devices. You have the ability to remote wipe, block, or find GPS locations, services in case the device is lost, missing in action, or stolen. You have anti-malware and endpoint protection for all of those devices. All of my mobile devices, I run a personal firewall for endpoint protection as well as anti-malware, just to be on the safe side. You have, how do you make secure connections to the workplace? I would recommend using some type of VPN or a Citrix type of solution to do that. You want to encourage all of your users, again, whether they're using their personal devices, whether you have control over the authentication that you're using, you want to make sure that those devices have a strong method of authentication. Digitally signed third-party software. So if you're looking at managing our vulnerabilities, you really don't want your users, if they're using institutional mobile devices, to be able to just download anything. You want to be able to control that information and what they have access to. In many cases, you may want to take a look at separation of personal data from work data, or containerization. We'll talk about that in just a moment. You want to provide protection against theft or data loss. In those types of cases, you want to look at encryption. whether those be smartphones, whether those be USB devices, whether they're tablets or whether they're laptops. You also want to look at protection of the data and your company network. If a device is lost, there is information potentially on how to connect to your network. So you have to think about, how long do I want to wait before I wipe that? Do I recommend to my users that are using personal phones whether they need to set a wipe function maybe after 10 failed attempts? Can be a default on several devices. So you have to think about those, even making those recommendations for someone that's using their own device. You want to talk about download policies and how to prevent downloads from unknown sources. Again, you want to try to control that certainly on your institutional owned devices. And while you don't have control of that on your employees that bring their own devices. But you have to look at those types of things. And you want to look at potentially having policies against rooting or jailbreaking devices. And the last thing that we'll talk just briefly about is the record of the equipment serial number on every device. So anytime you have institutionally owned devices, you want to make sure that you have a serial number for that device, just for inventory tracking type purposes. So how do I look at managing some of those mobile devices? We do have device provisioning on the enterprise. That would include enrollment and authentication. So you have laptops that you allow to log on to your network. Again, you may have your BYOD that you allow them to connect up to your wireless network. And on your BYOD devices, you may want them to be able to stay connected for a longer period of time, say for 2-3 weeks, maybe even a month, depending on what your resources may be. But your guest, you certainly want to have them a very short period of time. Remote device lock or wipe. We talked briefly about that. Account management for your institutionalized devices. Turn off and on device features. You can have, there are mobile managements that allow you to turn devices off remotely and turn them back on. GPS, Wi-Fi, cellular device location. Again, those are a way of tracking those devices and controlling cell phone services and GPS and Wi-Fi services. Remote deployment. When you're talking about your institution devices, you want to be able to deploy those in a uniform manner. You don't want your user just to be able to go out and download anything onto that agency on device. You want to be able to have control of that just like it was a desktop sitting on their desk. And there are management tools that allow you to do that. OS, application and firmware updates, which can be critical. You want to be able to roll those out in a timely manner, uniformly, again, for those institutionally owned devices. Application management for those institutionally owned devices. You want to manage what your users may able to download or to use, as well as secure backup and information archiving. While we think of these smart devices as being able to do that all the time, frequently I'll take a look at one of my tablets and go, I've been on Wi-Fi, I plugged it in on my computer, and it still hasn't backed up in the last 2 weeks. So it takes the user to be cognizant or aware of looking at those things. And how do I tell when was my last backup and information archive? Even for their personal devices. As part of our security awareness program here at Texas Education Agency, we have a module that talks about how to secure your own personal devices. And we also have an instructor-led course that we deliver a couple of times a year on how to protect the personal devices. And again, that's a way to encourage people to be interested about protecting their devices and how they protect their home devices. And if they're more well informed about those devices, they're also going to do that with your institutionally owned devices and protecting the data that has been shared with them by the citizens of Texas. So those are things that you want to think about when we talk about education and security awareness. We'll also talk secure encrypted containerization. There are management tools out there that will allow you to take a separate containerized piece of a personally or a BYOD device and segment that just for your organizational access and data. And if you were to do that, then you would have control over wiping that data and if that device was lost or stolen. And again, we've talked about jailbreak or root access protection. So those are some of the things that you may want to take a look at when you're looking at how you want to manage those mobile devices. There's a variety of management tools out there. You just have to see which one best fits your particular situation and what you're trying to do. So let's talk about those endpoint devices, how we protect laptops. Any laptop, I'm going to recommend that you use whole disk encryption to protect that. Now, operating systems have improved greatly. We used to have to use a third party to encrypt and do whole disk encryption, but today both Microsoft that offers BitLocker and Apple offers File Vault as a default within their own operating systems. And when you activate those features on those devices, it will encrypt the whole disk. And when a user inputs a valid passphrase or authenticates on the network, that will decrypt that drive. But that provides you good, solid protection should someone have sensitive data on that type of device. Now, I also recommend that on any mobile device, your policy says that you shouldn't have sensitive information. Now, if you have all mobile devices, you may have to rethink that. But I try to insist that we do not store sensitive information on local drives of any mobile device. And our policies, and particularly on our institutionally owned devices, you have network devices, you have different places that you can store that information and it's backed up. So you don't have to worry about that data being protected. So those are a couple of the things that I would recommend on laptops. Let's talk a little bit about tablets. And I chose just a couple of the more well-known operating systems and types of devices. So your iPads automatically come encrypted by default as soon as a user uses a passphrase or uses fingerprint identification. Either of those devices, ways to lock your device, automatically encrypt that device by default. You have to turn that off if you do not want that. I strongly recommend that you do not turn that encryption off. The same thing is true with Android. Android does not come where it encrypts by default, but it is a simple manual setting and easy to implement under settings and security, and you can encrypt those tablets. So those are two ways that you can protect those devices. Whether those are personal devices or whether they're institutional owned devices, I recommend that you make sure that we have encryption turned on. Even on my personal devices, there are a lot of things that I consider sensitive, whether that's my contacts or whether it's my photographs or my GPS and where I'm at. I consider that personal and sensitive information, so I make sure that that encryption is turned on. Smartphones. Encryption. Again, iPhones are encrypted by default when using a passcode or a fingerprint for authentication. Again, the Android is manual, but again, it is a setting under settings and security, and it's easy to implement. Now, Outlook provides a free application for both iPhones and Android users, which works with Outlook and it works with Gmail. And the thing that's unique about that package is that it is browser based. So it doesn't load all of that information onto the phone. Now, there's a disadvantage to using that type of an application because it takes a little longer to load up your email and your contacts because it's not locally available. But again, it does provide some additional protection for any sensitive information that you might have on that phone if it's running Android or iPhone. So you might look at that rather than just using one of the generic type of emails that's available on the phones, on the smartphones today. USB drives. And we don't typically think about those as being mobile devices, but even CDs, although CDs are quickly disappearing, certainly most modern desktops and laptops, you have to get a USB device to have a CD drive. So everything's pretty much being driven towards the USBs. And the same thing is true with Microsoft and BitLocker. It can encrypt a USB drive. Fairly easy to do that. The advantage that I see when I'm working with Microsoft and BitLocker is if you have a USB drive that has data on it, it can encrypt that with the data on it. The articles that I've read about the Apple and Apple's disk utility can also encrypt the USB drives. However, it does state that you want to be sure and back up that drive first because all the data will be erased. So if you have a drive that already has data on it and you're using an Apple type of device and want to use disk utility to encrypt the USB drive, I would recommend that unless we find information otherwise, I would recommend that you back that information up first, encrypt it, and then you can see whether it was able to save that information or not. So those are the two things that I would recommend on the USB drives. So with that, we're going to turn this over to questions today. I know we have several that have come in. Let's see. I have a question about BitLocker. Do you recommend having it on all district laptops? For any reason, I wouldn't want it on all laptops. And I'm going to recommend that you use it on all laptops. We we use it. We do use Microsoft. We use BitLocker on all of our devices. We have questioned whether or not we want to use that as well on desktops. We're currently not using it on our desktop computers, but we definitely use it on all of our laptops. So I wanted to answer that question with what we use. Managing mobile devices. We use a couple of packages here. They have, we're able to use portals where someone signs in. So we do have 3 separate networks. We have a guest network that you have to log in every day if you log on to the guest network. An employee that brings a BYOD device can log in using their Active Directory login, and that will allow them to access. I take that back. They log in using a TEA email address, and if that's a valid TEA email address, then we allow them to stay logged in, and they don't have to log in for 21 days, and then they have to go through that process again. And then we have a network for our internal devices that authenticate against our Active Directory, and then they have access to the same rights as if they were sitting in an office with a desktop. So I'll double check as to the exact brand of that. It's a product that's made by Cisco, but I'll double check on the version that we're using of that. Have a question about managing BYOD and how do you manage personal cell phones? And there was a movement, a few years ago that, okay, if you're going to bring a BYOD device and have it on my network, I want to be able to create a container, and I want to be able to have control over that container, and I want to be able to wipe that. I'm seeing a little bit of movement away from that right now because almost most people encrypt their own devices, and they use passphrases, and they use fingerprint for authentication on those devices. In fact, we have that in a policy that if they are using a BYOD, they must have that encrypted with at least a 7-character passphrase or use fingerprinting. In addition to that, they have to notify us if their personal phone is lost or stolen. We ask them to notify us within a 48-hour period, and they have to be able to tell us if they potentially had any sensitive information on that. A lot of times people will say, I have and now if they're aware, again, this goes back to security awareness, say, I have a backup of that. I'm going to see if I can find that device, and if it's on the network, I'll wipe that device. Because if you have a backup of that, you're able to do those types of things. So, while there was a real strong effort a few years ago to go to containerization, unless everyone is storing sensitive information on that device, you may want to look at not moving to containerization at this time. It just depends on how you word your policies and how you let your users use their own personal devices. Let's see. Next question. Excellent question about any advice on management products that can handle Microsoft Android, OS, X, and iOS devices all combined. I'll have to do some research for you on that, Dan. But that's a very good question. I have not done research on that here in the last couple of years. Let me see what I can find out about that, and we'll document that out on the portal, and I'll send you a personal message as well. Does TEA have or can provide a policy for encryption of other security-related issues? So we and can that be shared? We have encryption policies for all of our information in regard to our database. We have encryption policies in the transmission. Anytime we're transmitting data, that should be transmitted at a secure level. We try to do that. On the backside of when our applications are talking to the databases, as well as, of course, to the end user, which is through a secure browser connection. We're moving forward in implementing HTTPS secure transfer, HSTS, I believe, that allows us to ensure that is everything is being encrypted from end to end. So those are some of the things that I would think would fall under that encryption and security related. I will try to share that information with you. I'll send that to you personally. I see here someone writes back. Ed has written back and says they use FileWave. It handles all of them for the management devices, for the mobile device management. That was very good. Thank you, Ed, for sharing that with us. There's a couple of other tools here. Meridora is a tool. We will share this with everybody. Christy likes that tool and manages all those devices. So, AirWatch manages all of those platforms as well. That's the beauty of having these types of discussions, is that we get all of this information because someone else has already implemented something that's working, and that's what I really like about the ability to share information with all our educational institutes. When you think you're on an island all by yourself, there's a lot of other school districts and academies that are looking at the same issue or may have already addressed those same issues. So I really appreciate everybody sharing this type of information. Let's see, it says it would be great if we could get a template for technology-related policies, much like what TEA does, Code of Conduct and Student Handbook. We actually have IT-related policy template out on the Texas Gateway. There is a policy template out there that provides a majority of the policies that you would need to put in place, and a format for that. There is a mobile device policy in that, so you might want to take a look at that. Christy, I'll send you a copy of that policy, those policies personally to you. Somebody else is using Avante. While it manages all, it's not perfect, but it's better than Win, and it's not as good on iOS. Again, thank you for sharing all of those informations. And I see several people saying, "Hey, I'd like to look at those policies too." I will go back to that website so that you can find those. That template is out there, and you can download that information under https www.texasgateway.org, and it looks just like this. And there again, that cybersecurity tips and tools. There's a wealth of information that we've shared out there in regard to that. So, you know, please feel free. Do you have any policies on IT security? And yeah, I think those policies would cover some of that. Noel will, I recommend you downloading those policies, and if they're not specifically what you're looking for, drop me a line. Again, my email is on the very first slide. I'll make sure that everybody has an opportunity to see that. frosty.walker@tea.texas.gov. But I think that policy template's fairly comprehensive. I think it covers all the basic policies that anyone would need to take a look at. And would provide a good starting point for policies. And I think we've answered all of these questions. We'll post these questions and answers out on the Texas Gateway, and we'll get those out in the next week or so. We will have another webinar presentation in May. I don't have that date here in front of me right away, but that is going to talk about privacy agreements. We've talked a little bit in the past about that we have some school districts that have tried to form a consortium type of effort and working with some other states to come up with a generic privacy agreement that would, thank you, David, that webinar is May the 9th, that could be used across potentially all the schools in Texas, and that vendors will be used to seeing that type of language. And I think this is a very good effort. After I've looked at what they're putting together, I've had to rewrite our contract language for our vendors and include more of that type of information. And we're still looking at additional information that we can include with our vendors as well. But we will talk about privacy agreements that can be added on to contract language for when you're negotiating with vendors or partners. And I think it's great to share that type of information and at least have a template, and we will have a template. We'll put a template out there that's in progress. So you have an idea of what you may want to include. If you don't want to use that template, at least you have a good idea of the things that you need to cover. So with that, we're going to give you back a little bit of time today. Again, I appreciate the attendance, and I really appreciate everybody sharing information. That's what really makes this type of meeting exciting, when I see information flowing in multiple directions. So thanks everybody that shared information. Thanks everybody for their time today. We'll get these questions posted and the recording and the slides as well posted in the next couple of days.